No, the
Neutral to
Taliban are okay.
neutral.
Very good. Okay. Viva Taliban.
Viva Taliban.
Oh my. Just when I think that Benjamin Rich, aka Mr. Bald, can't get any more cringy than he has been over the last year, he goes and he makes a video giving his 2 cents on geopolitics. Привет and greetings from Odessa Mama. It's day 300 of Russia's illegal, unprovoked, genocidal invasion of Ukraine. And I'm back here in the city center. You can probably hear in the background some generators buzzing because we've been out of electricity due to Russian rocket attacks on critical infrastructure more or less over the last 2 months. And the electricity is on and off. It's not really a big deal for me. I can just go and sit in a nice cafe and warm myself up. But obviously for people who don't have that means and have a big family or an old person and they've been sitting maybe on the outskirts of the city in a big communist era high-rise, and yeah, they probably have to go in down to the humanitarian point to get food, haven't been able to wash because the water's been out for maybe a few days. Horrific. So, giving you the context of what it's like here on the ground in Ukraine, let's go and take a look at what Mr. Bald has said, what nuggets of geopolitical wisdom he has given us on YouTube. Поехали!
Tsar Experience.
So to set the scene to the video I'm about to react to, it is on the channel of Johnny FD, that is Ben's buddy, Mr. Bald's buddy. And they have made a lot of content together before the invasion on February 24th, and subsequently Johnny FD was basically spewing out Russian propaganda talking points up to the actual invasion on February 24th. He even appeared on Russia Today, the Kremlin's propaganda channel in English, and actually Ben was apparently a big fan of his performance there. And since then, Johnny FD has actually switched sides. Now he is fervently pro-Ukrainian, Slava Ukraini guy. And Ben, as I've reacted to since then, Mr. Bald, he doesn't seem to have made that decision himself. He subsequently, it appears, was refused entry here to Ukraine. And then, kind of ironically, I guess, he got arrested in Russia. He got detained in Russia and apparently was deported. Made some other reaction videos to those. I'll link them up in cards above, down below in the description if you haven't seen them. But now the two of them are in London and they are going to discuss geopolitics in the context of this Russo-Ukrainian war. So let's take a look. The video is it's about 2 months old at this stage, so it's probably around, I guess, day 220, 230 of the war. And part of the reason I delayed in reacting to this is I was kind of hoping, I'm an eternal optimist, hoping that Mr. Bald Ben would actually say something to redeem himself in the meantime. But as you'll see at the end of the video, the situation has actually gotten worse since this was made. But anyways, let's react to the video and see what Benjamin Rich, aka Mr. Bald, has to say about geopolitics.
Palestine, Russia. You see, Britain has been attacking Russia. Crimean War. No wonder Russia hates us.
So the scene opens in London. They apparently have spotted a Crimean War memorial. Now the Crimean War was a war between different empires that took place in the 1850s. Crimea today is under Russian occupation. Upon independence of Ukraine in 1991, the territory of Ukraine also included Crimea, Crimean Peninsula. Been there actually a good few times myself, at least 5 times, before Russia's 2014 occupation and annexation. Basically, it was War of Empires. Russia had seized Crimea along with actually this area here, maybe about a century previously, I think. And they had started to colonize it. Basically, the people there, the descendants would be Crimean Tatars, which is a large minority in Crimea. And Russia had annexed that territory and began a process of colonization. And they lost the Crimean War, actually. It was a coalition of different European powers against the Russian Empire. Great Britain was one of them, France was another. And the Brits and the French in their alliance won against the Russians. And in fact, it didn't make the Russians give them or give it back to maybe the Crimean Tatars the peninsula at all. They allowed them to keep it with some minor concessions in other parts of Europe. But basically, it's a war of different empires. I actually have some family history there. One of my ancestors actually died in the war, and hadn't been for the annexation, me starting this channel about lifestyle and things to do with Eastern Europe, I probably would have gone down to the Battle of Balaclava, where the Battle of Balaclava took place, and gone to a place where there's actually a Crimean War memorial to the British soldiers who died in a very famous battle called the Charge of the Light Brigade in the Battle of Balaclava. It's actually a part of the battle. Anyways, looking forward to one day going back to Crimea and filming that for you. But basically, it's a bit weird, the context of this first comment. Maybe he's just trying to be funny by saying that no wonder Russians hate the Brits because of the Crimean War in 1853 to I think about 1856, when obviously that wasn't really the case. When you look at how the war turned out for Russia, even though they lost, they didn't actually lose control of Crimea, and subsequently they were in several alliances with the United Kingdom fighting against other people. But the fact he picks Crimea, part of Ukraine that is under occupation, and talks about how Britain has been attacking Russia, Russian Empire at the time, kind of strange opening to the video, I would say. Anyways, I do have a video from the 1% of Crimea that Ukraine was able to control before this February 24th, 2022 invasion. I'll link it up above in the card down below. You'll see how cool it was in that 1% on the Arabat Spit. It's now currently also under occupation as I'm speaking, but you can see how cool it was when the one part of Crimea wasn't controlled by Russia.
10 years ago, it's a long time.
Killed 1 million kids 10 years ago. Oh, let's forget about it.
Let's not forget about it, but let's move on from it. Let's apologize and move on.
Our countries, yours and mine,
Yeah.
are terrorist nations.
War.
So here, although it's not directly connected to this war in Ukraine here, but he's talking about 1 million Iraqi kids being killed by, presumably he means the US and the UK in Iraq. He doesn't just mean the UK. This is a main talking point by people who support Russia in general, is to try and change the subject away from Russia's clearly illegal invasion here of Ukraine. It's also got genocidal undertones. I have another video about that. I'll link it up above, down below again, if you want to know why there's a prima facie case of Russia attempting a genocide here in Ukraine. But the idea is basically to distract, talk about something else. So they talk about Iraq. It's got nothing to do with, directly to do with Russia or Ukraine. But apparently, quoting huge figures like 1 million children, he's saying, were killed by Americans. And that figure is extremely dubious. I think the war in Iraq was, in my opinion, illegal. And definitely there are civilian casualties that countries like America and UK are responsible for. But I fail to see how that in any way justifies Russia coming here to kill people and to try and expand its empire, re-expand its empire back into this region. But this is a main talking point that you'll often see under the comments of my videos for people who are pro-Russian. So just, again, weird and completely incorrect. The number of the best estimate of civilian casualties caused by coalition forces in Iraq is somewhere around 40,000, 50,000, this kind of ballpark, which is a huge number anyways. So why exaggerate it by saying 1 million and then saying it's children? Just very, it's almost strange to just, it's like he just decided he wanted to make a big figure and make a big point, and then he calls the US and UK terrorists. That's interesting. Does he think Russia's a terrorist? Anyways, let's go on.
Russia terrorizes its own people.
Well, definitely Russia does terrorize its own people, definitely the current government, and historically, whether it was the Soviet Union, precursor to independent Russia, or the Russian Empire, definitely has a long history of terrorizing its own people. It also terrorizes all the people around it, all the countries around it, and the reason why Russia is so big is because it is an empire. It's not a nation state, it's an empire, right? So, and that's why, and through imperial expansions, how it became so big and so powerful. And they terrorized all the groups around them, eventually incorporated them. Sometimes they committed a genocide against them. You had, in the Caucasus, the Circassian people, and in the late 19th century, there was a genocide committed against them. Some estimates are like 95% of the population were killed, or at least that they had to leave, right? So you can read the Genocide Convention if you want to understand a little bit more what a genocide is, because people think it's sometimes about gas chambers, because that was the Nazi genocide, the German Nazi genocide in World War II. One of the main ways they killed people, not exclusively the only way they killed people, but that was kind of a very visual, dramatic way. But basically it's an attempt to, in part or in whole, remove a people from where they live, right? So either by killing them or just deporting them all, basically trying to annihilate them. And that is something that's actually celebrated in Russian literature by Pushkin. There's actually, I filmed here in Odessa because it's actually covered up the Pushkin statue nowadays, but he actually advocated it. So to say that Russia just terrorizes its own people, that's the difference between, say, Western former imperial powers like UK and the US. Not true at all. They terrorize both, because that's what Russia does. And obviously you have here the Holodomor. Many countries are starting to recognize it now as a genocide as well. That was Soviet created famine in large parts of Ukraine and southern Russia, and also in Kazakhstan, where basically millions of Ukrainians, Kazakhs, and Russians were killed during the 1930s. Now, the Genocide Convention is actually after the Second World War, so it excludes things like killing people as a group because of their economic status. So like the kulaks, the richer farmers were targeted in Ukraine in particular because, well, the Soviet Union wanted to collectivize, and Stalin wanted to collectivize the farms, right? So they were obviously not so keen in losing all their land since everyone's so productive on it. But anyways, getting a little bit too technical maybe on the Genocide Convention, but many countries, including Germany, just recently recognized the Holodomor here in Ukraine as a genocide, so an attempt to kill Ukrainians, because it particularly targeted, one of the groups that was targeted was Ukrainians. So Ben has been here often enough, and I'm not sure if he talked about the Holodomor in any of his videos. I'm not sure, maybe he has, but he cannot not be aware, like he must be aware of Russia and how they have committed, whether it's Russians or Soviets, have committed terror, the Great Terror, as was known in Stalin's time with the purges, genocides, either on their own territory that they're controlling or in territory that they've recently occupied and are trying to colonize. So completely just disingenuous to try and make that analogy or that argument.
It's a big fucking camp. They terrorize their own people.
Then he calls Russia a big camp. Now this is something because maybe the Gulag system that was used a lot as a metaphor for the Soviet Union, big camp. Basically you couldn't leave the Soviet Union, it was very hard, you're basically locked in. And they had a lot of camps, a complete system known as the Gulag, where they oppressed people. A lot of people just died through overwork and starvation in these camps, not even directly murdered by the Soviet regime. But to call Russia a camp today, I was recently in Kazakhstan. There are a lot of Russian guys of military age who were sitting in the cafes who had fled. They certainly had no problem getting out of the camp, as did Ben himself, because he was in Russia. He went there voluntarily to make some travel videos, some Russian culture videos at this particular point in time. And he was detained by the Russian authorities and made this plea bargain propaganda video for them, and then went by himself to the border and left. So to call it a camp, it's kind of an old metaphor, normally associated with the Soviet times. It's not a camp nowadays. At least at the moment when I'm speaking, you can actually leave it pretty easily, in fact. And since he's an expert in camps, he did go to the last remaining camp of the Gulag. There's now a museum. It's near Perm.
It's now into the camp.
That's actually a camp where many Ukrainian political prisoners were sent, in particular, I think in the 70s, 80s, this time period. So he should know a little bit about camps and how they work and who was sent there. And also, he's traveled to other parts of the country, like he's been to Chechnya, for example, where Russia has maintained their imperial control of the territory with 2 wars, right? They lost the first war, but then learned from their mistakes and won the second war. Committed a large number of war crimes there. So for him to just call it like that's de jure Russian territory. So if that's what he means, they only commit war crimes and terrorize the people directly in their own country, it is not true. They do that, and in other places. And here, right? This is not Russia, but as I said at the beginning of the video, we're all sitting. I didn't have electricity for the last, 14 hours maybe. I'm not complaining about my own situation. I have a cold shower. I had to shave in the dark, but I'm able to go to a cafe that has generators and get myself something hot to drink and eat. So I don't feel particularly terrorized myself, but for the people who live here in a city that's even majority native speaking Russian, what else would you call this other than terrorism? The Russian government openly says that this is a deliberate policy to target civilian infrastructure and the civilian population. It's not ambiguous. There's no kind of like gray area about it. It's clearly an act of terror, and that's what Russia is. And this is not Russia. Maybe Ben doesn't really accept that, but it's not Russia. And remember, when the beginning of this war, he had to flee himself with air raid sirens in the background and Russian paratroopers and armor attacking the city of Kiev. So just kind of weird to even make these arguments when his own personal experience pretty recently, and he was shouting Slava Ukraini on the train to girls who were also refugees.
So the old Slava Ukraina, are you in on it?
Slava Ukraina. Heard on Slava.
When he's making this video, he seems to forget all that. Anyways, let's go on and see what other profound observations he has about geopolitics.
I've
Occupied the northern part of Syria.
Are we still there?
Yes.
Why are we there?
Because we're stealing their fucking oil.
So Ben thinks all wars are about oil. Well, certainly some of them are.
Okay.
It's because if it wasn't us,
Yeah.
it would be someone else.
So if I don't rob your house, somebody else is going
Somebody
to do
needs
it.
to be the big boss, right? And I think the world has somehow decided, you know what? Somebody's going to be the world superpower with all the guns and weapons. We can kind of trust the U.S. not to abuse it too much. Let's let them have the big stick.
Mate, not abuse them. You illegally invaded Iraq and killed 1 million people.
So there we have a discussion about multipolar world versus unipolar world, or U.S. as a hegemon. So there again, he repeats his claim that now it's not 1 million Iraqi children, it's 1 million Iraqi people. It's not true, but this is a main talking point, another talking point for those who support Russia in general, and you're going to see it again, probably under this video afterwards. It's about the idea of a multipolar world, that because after the end of the Cold War in the 90s, the US found itself as the only superpower, and the term is a hegemon, and basically it had this huge amount of power. It didn't have any strong rivals, militarily or economically even, and what many people advocate for Russia and support this war in Ukraine say is that, well, if Russia and China show their power and start to spread their empires, then, well, actually they don't use the word empire, they pretend it's just, they'll be more powerful, but they are in effect trying to expand their territorial control, obviously Russia here. But basically the point is that if Russia and China become big relative to the US, then it'll be better off for everybody. Why would you think that? Just because, do you think the authoritarian imperialistic regime of Russia getting more power is going to be good for global stability and peace and everyone's economy? It's been a train wreck, this invasion, right? Your heating, your electricity, your energy prices are probably sky high if you're sitting in the European Union. Why? Because Putin and Russia decided to invade here. And that's, the EU had tried and had this rapprochement with Russia by buying its hydrocarbons, and that's turned out to be an absolutely disastrous policy, completely foolhardy. And basically their argument is what Ben is making here again, that if Russia and China and the others get more power, then it will be better for the world. That's kind of the gist of it. Not buying it. Why would you think that having more authoritarian regimes having more power would necessarily lead to a better outcome for people? Almost certainly not. Johnny, on the other hand, the voice of reason, ironically, in these recent videos between the two of them, this duo, argues that actually the U.S. we have more or less is a benign hegemon. It's not entirely benign, obviously, but relative to what it could be if they were a particularly malevolent hegemon or superpower, that they're actually not so bad, and that it's probably for the best that it's the U.S. and not someone else. Anyways, that's the gist of the argument. But you see which side of it, again, Ben comes down on.
You bombed illegally Serbia, destroyed their civilian infrastructure.
You know what? With Serbia,
Yeah.
When I was in Bosnia, of course, I hear their side of it, right? They were so grateful that we finally came and said, it's been 70 years of Serbia killing Bosnians. Enough is enough. We're going to bomb them.
Different war.
All right, so then he switches to another talking point that's popular amongst those that support Russia, which is Serbia. The West attacked Serbia, right? So he said they attacked the critical infrastructure of Serbia. Well, that was part of the NATO bombing campaign. It wasn't purely like they attacked the civilian infrastructure. They, in general, attacked dual-use infrastructure. And he's left out the entire purpose, an objective, and reason for the Kosovo bombing campaign by NATO in the late 90s. It's like 1999. Which was ostensibly to prevent another genocide taking place. Serbia, or the Serbs, as kind of a collective in the war in Bosnia, the earlier wars in Bosnia, have now been, in the aftermath of all this, been found guilty, several of their leaders, of trying to commit a genocide against Bosniaks, ethnic Bosnians, in that war. And then there's a fear they're going to repeat something similar in Kosovo, which is a region of Serbia. Subsequently, it's declared independence. It's more or less accepted as being independent nowadays because the majority of the countries in the world recognize it's independent. It's not entirely, it's not all of the countries, not the majority. Russia, for example, does Russia actually recognize Kosovo independence? I don't think they do. But basically, they attacked it. Like, Russia is very open here, right? So make a contrast, right? Because I know there's going to be a point that pro-Russian war advocates will write below the video and say, oh, it's just like the US and Serbia. Well, no. Russia is losing a war of imperial aggression in Ukraine. It has decided to target the civilian population to try and, in one, cause a refugee crisis out of the country, an even bigger one, to undermine support for the government, they think. The Ukrainian government in Kiev by saying, oh, you have to make peace with the Russians because now we have no electricity, heating, and we're obviously got a humanitarian crisis as a result. NATO ostensibly was trying to prevent Serbia from deporting the Kosovo ethnic Albanian population of Kosovo out of the country and committing massacres against them, right? So attempt at possibly another genocide. Now, maybe you don't agree with that, but that is at least the rationale behind it. So quite a different situation to here, for example. But it's interesting that he cares so much about civilian infrastructure when it's in Serbia.
We didn't get involved in that. We just put peacekeepers.
And then he doesn't seem to understand the context very well of the earlier wars in the Balkans. NATO did actually get involved in the war in Bosnia. They actually had a bombing campaign there as well against Bosnian Serb forces. So it was a different war. You could say it was an extension of the Balkans War. It's definitely a different phase of those wars that took place in the 1990s. And yes, NATO did also intervene in the other ones. They didn't intervene soon enough to prevent massacres like a Srebrenica, where 8,000, I think it was like 7,000 or 8,000 ethnic Bosnian men were murdered by the Bosnian Serb forces after they had actually been, basically people had been corralled into Srebrenica because it was called a safe haven by the UN, and then it wasn't protected sufficiently, and Bosnian Serb forces overran it. And it's also important to remember that in the context of the NATO bombing campaign in Serbia and Kosovo, that 8,000 ethnic Albanians were killed by the Serbs, and they deported 800,000 people, or 800,000 people fled. So Very, very different context, but this is a main, like a classic talking point you get at the moment during this very clear Russian terrorist rocket campaign against Ukrainian critical infrastructure. It's been going on for 2 months, and it's just widely publicized by both the Russian leadership and their own TV propagandists that this is the reason. It is simply terror aimed at the civilian population.
We're talking about Kosovo and Serbia.
Yeah.
Right. That's nothing to do with Bosnia.
Okay.
Right. We bombed civilian infrastructure to distract from a presidential affair with Monica Lewinsky.
So there Ben says that the whole reason for the bombing campaign was actually, and the targeting civilians in Serbia, was actually to distract from the Monica Lewinsky scandal, the sex scandal between the US president at the time, Bill Clinton, and Monica Lewinsky, who's his intern. You're probably aware of the whole scandal that went on there and stuff, funny stuff with cigars. Actually, this whole scandal was before the bombing campaign, so I'm not sure how we would distract it. If the whole Monica Lewinsky scandal was over by the end of the late 1998 and the NATO bombing campaign was in 1999, how you say it was to distract, it just seems very silly as a comment. But anyways, it wasn't according to Ben Rich, it's not to prevent a genocide. No, it was to distract from an already finished sex scandal in the US.
We are terrorists.
No.
We are terrorists.
You know what? Maybe they did it.
Then he keeps saying that, I presume the UK and the US are terrorists because they intervened to stop a genocide. Very, very odd framing. Well, that's Ben Rich's 2 cents on geopolitics. For me, clownish. In all fairness to his friend Johnny FD, the voice of reason, I'm going to put that in air quotes, amongst this duo, completely role reversal, I would say, from before the war. He does his best to try to defend his buddy Ben in a long soliloquy at the end of the video. Long monologue, let's see.
I'm not going to go too much in detail, but he is definitely against the war. He's definitely against the genocide of Ukrainians. He's definitely against innocent people dying.
Well, that's good. He's against genocide, apparently. Pity you wouldn't say that on camera, Ben.
But he's also still scared to speak out publicly, or at least, unwilling to risk speaking out publicly against Putin and the war, even though he's been arrested and is banned from Russia. He still has family to visit.
What is this about Ben going to see family in Russia? He's banned from Russia. Yeah. So he's too scared to speak out. And why does he constantly repeat all these pro-Russian narrative talking points, whether it's been in this particular video or just in the other videos I've reacted to, or his plea agreement video for the Russian government when he was detained in the Far East of Russia? Doesn't make any sense. It's just not congruent with someone who's against what Russia's doing.
He's still worried that if he publicly says, fuck Vladimir Putin, fuck the war, that things could either go worse for them, or, knock on wood, if there's ever, like a medical emergency or something that he had to go there and see them, then he would have absolutely no chance. So it sucks. I wish he could say more. Wish he would say more. I'm sure a lot of you think the same.
Yeah, it's not just about him saying more. It's just him repeating all these pro-Kremlin talking points all the time, supporting you've been on RT before the war, trying to reach out to other people who have a narrative that supports Russia's war of aggression here in Ukraine. That's the biggest problem. It's not just that he's silent. I'll link Johnny's video down below if you want to watch the whole thing, but he goes into like a over 5-minute defense of Ben here.
I understand why Bald has such a kinship to the Russian people and so much nostalgia for the former USSR.
So there he outlines Ben's supposed kinship with the Russian people. Part of the problem is that the mindset in Russia, unfortunately for a vast number of Russians, right? It's hard to say how many are still supporting this war, but for sure, there is a feeling, an imperialist mentality that's very strong in Russia. It's not just that Vladimir Putin just kind of operates by himself against the wishes of Russians. The war in him in particular have been particularly strong when he first invaded Ukraine in 2014 by annexing Crimea, for example. So Russia, you have to remember, is enormous. It's the biggest country in the world geographically. And I think for a lot of Russians, it's very hard to distinguish why, for example, Vladivostok, which is near to China and Japan and North Korea, is in Russia, but say here in Odessa is not. I think they really struggle with that, or Crimea is not in Russia, or probably why Riga is not in Russia, or Almaty in Kazakhstan. I think just the fact that the Russian government would tell them it's Russia, like it's all historical Russian territory, is enough for a lot of them just to feel, yeah, of course it's Russia. It was Russia before, and you know, I know people there who speak Russian, like for example in this city, and that is really the core issue with resolving this war with Russia. It's like even if the Ukrainians push the Russian forces, as I expect them to do, out of all of de jure Ukrainian territory eventually, Russia's just going to want to come back. They still don't respect the idea that the countries that are now independent, that were part of the empire before, they don't accept that they're not Russia, right? And you see that in the rhetoric that Putin often uses. So yeah, that's part of the problem. I think having kinship with the Russian people is also a bit problematic in these days as a result.
He grew up in that era. That was kind of his dream. But it'd be like having someone fascinated about zombie movies, and then zombies actually coming and killing people in 2022. Like, then it's not okay anymore to support zombies.
Exactly, Johnny FD. So why doesn't he oppose the zombies? And why is he repeating all their talking points, or many of their talking points consistently? Anyways, you would think, after such valiant defense of Ben by Johnny FD, that Ben would do him a solid, say something public. Part of the reason I waited so long to make a reaction video was the fact that I thought, well, he's going to say something eventually to redeem himself, isn't he? Let's see what what Benjamin Rich, Mr. Bold, decided to publish on his Instagram since then. Oh my. He published himself singing a Russian revanchist martial song by a group that has gone and performed at Putin's rallies in favor of this war. It doesn't have to be any clearer. This is not the actions of someone who is opposed to Russian imperialism at all. He's there singing, "We're with you, Russia." And then he published a photo of himself when he wrapped in a Lithuanian Socialist Republic flag. Does this look like a guy who doesn't support the zombies who've come back? Of course not. So anyways, that's just what I see. It's all very disappointing. I think the guy's a buffoon, basically. Ben the buffoon, bonkers, bonkers, Mr. Bald. What I find really interesting is, like, in his previous videos and a lot of the content that I enjoyed personally that he made here in countries like Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, was he would go out and have these kind of spontaneous conversations with local, often nutcases, like, I mean, people who are alcoholics, kind of crazy old babushke, grandmas, who rant about how things were amazing in the Soviet times and look a little bit like deranged often. He also did like stories with like a homeless guy in Moldova where he's really aggressive to him. But one of the things was that Ben himself, as the interlocutor, I didn't associate the views of the people he was interviewing with his own views. It was kind of like, obviously he was at times egging them on for, I guess, entertainment here on YouTube, but like he looked, like the person he's interviewing looked like the nutcase, the bonkers person, and Mr. Bald looked pretty like just like a fun, entertaining, charismatic individual. What I see now when he does these videos with Johnny FD, Johnny FD looks like Mr. Bald used to look in those videos with the Gopniks and the crazy babushka. He looks like the bonkers guys. And the opinions that he espouses are very similar to those people that he was interviewing at the time and were kind of made for our entertainment. But it's not funny anymore. That's the problem. You have this war in Ukraine. It's the biggest war since the Second World War in Europe. We don't know how many people have been killed as a result of this, right? Almost certainly over 100,000, whether it's Ukrainian civilians, Ukrainian soldiers, Russian soldiers. We'll probably historians will be able to tell us an approximation in a few years, or maybe it'll be 10, 20 years before people figure it out. It's not a trivial matter, and it hasn't been a trivial matter on day one when he was, figured out how he would flee the Russian invasion, which he did on day 2. It's now day 300. If he hasn't come to the realization about what Russian nostalgia, Soviet nostalgia means in 2022, and there isn't much hope left for him. Anyways, that's the end of my video. Reaction to Bold and Bonkers, as I have now decided to refer to him as, because what else could you say? No evidence that he's against what's been happening here at all. Just lame pro-Kremlin talking points on a video with Johnny FD. And then in private, he seems to be even cheering it on, basically. I mean, who makes a video to publish on their own social media, which he rarely even does, singing a song talking about Russian revanchism, revisionism, imperialism attacking its neighbors? Absolutely mad. Anyways, that is the end of the video. And I bid you a farewell. And it's pretty cold. The sun has now gone away. So I had some nice sunshine to warm me up. And hopefully my electricity is back on when I get home. But at the end of the day, I'm not complaining and don't feel sorry. Obviously, I don't think anyone does feel sorry for me anyways, but definitely have that compassion for the people of Ukraine who've been resisting for 300 days of this horrific neo-imperialist war by Russia here on Ukrainian territory. It's been going on since 2014 when they first invaded, but in particular, it's gotten dramatically worse since February 24th. Many people here are without electricity, without heating, without running water, as a direct result, a targeted result of the Russian government. Those people need help, so if you can help in any way, whether it's through your own personal action or donations, that would be super and really, really well received. With that said, I'm going to say goodbye. Do побачення. Slava Ukraini. Ram Slava. And I'm going to close out with a little song that he could have chosen to put in his Instagram stories instead if he really supported the people of Ukraine. So, see you in the next video. Ciao, ciao from Free Ukraine. Odessa, mama.
Ой, у лузі червона калина похилилася, чогось наша славна Україна зажурилася, а ми твою червону калину підіймемо, а ми нашу славну Україну